Topic here is the introduction for the section on race. So the first task I want you to do is define race in your notes. Think about what you will include and what you will exclude from your definition. Next task we're going to do is this fill in the blank section. So I just want you to take a second and think about how you would respond. All whites are black. What is the first thought or image that enters your mind? Now, some people will probably say that this is going to be offensive, and that, I assure you, is not the point. What I'm trying to do here is to give you an understanding of the impact of social constructs. So here I'm just playing around with the labels. All whites are blank. So in your definition of race, one of the things I'm going to focus on is the biological and try to make the point that there's one race, the human race, and everything else is a made-up social construct. So if we take, for example, these two right here, all whites and all blacks, that is buying into Blumenbach's theory on race, where he used the idea of race as a color. If you're going to say that all whites are Caucasian, now we're talking about a region. Are you from the Caucasus area? All Asians are blank. One of the things I'll usually get for this is smart. So I don't necessarily know how this is biological. If there's one race, the human race, how are we going to say that all Asians are smart? I'll give you another example. One of the things that often come up for white is rich. All whites are rich. Well, how does that have anything to do with genetics and biology and race? That is an economic label there, but it's somehow being used to define what it means to be white in America. Puerto Ricans are, and then I use Hispanics. So here I'm playing with additional labels just to kind of point out the complexities. My experience, when you use the labels, you have just figured out a way to divide people, and that is what we are trying to avoid. Google form data, you want to make sure you complete that. And now we're looking at the first definition. So for the most part, you are responsible for knowing these definitions here. I will definitely focus on race. And for this class, I want you to think of race as biology, physical features, all of that stuff. The physical features, yes, we all have eyes, we all have a nose, we all have a mouth. If you're going to make the argument about specific hair texture, about skin color, that is a dangerous path, and we want to try to avoid that. So for this class, we are going to look at race as a biological definition and argue that everything else seems to be a made-up social construct. Ethnicity. So human beings with a common ancestor, nation, language, and religion. I don't necessarily know how that works, because we cannot argue that any of this is biological, because that would be for race. And again, all I'm trying to do is play around with these labels. Assimilation is when one group adopts the majority culture, and we want to know about the different segregation types. De facto, I always take facto, factor, the unknown, and there's another factor for the segregation. Maybe people just feel comfortable. If we're talking about the gay community in the Castro and they want to all live there because they're trying to protect from harassment in the 1970s, the factor that is segregating is the fear. Whereas de jure, I always take jure and I think of jury, and I say, well, that's segregation that happens by law. Culture, we're looking at common patterns of human activity. Anything could be a culture. Customization of cars is a culture. Sneakers, sneaker culture, there is such a thing. Hip hop, that is another culture. So when you have a common language, dance, food, that is when we start to think about culture. And as for nationality, I just want you to think about the nation, and let's just take that. So just some of the ways that I'm going to approach this, and some people might have issue with that. I understand that this is a complex topic. So we're going to first look at Blumenbach. I already mentioned this individual. Blumenbach is the man contributing to the 1800 theories on race, and he is going to make the point that race as a color. We could also look at the work of Sir Francis Galton. Sir Francis Galton, here we see the dates of his particular work, and he seems to be concerned about eugenics and looking at the superiority of races, and he's traveling around the world and he's trying to make connections about physical characteristics, about skull size and things like that. Just give you an idea of some of Galton's work. Africa for the Chinese. So here he talks a little bit about various groups. He mentions here the Arabs. He mentions here the Chinese. If we're going to say Chinese, is that a race? I don't think that is a race. Are they from China? Because then that would be a nation. So all of this stuff is complicated. And as I said before, when you start dividing, you are on a slippery path there. And that's one of the things that I'm going to focus on in the race section. Poorly peopled bulk of Africa, the Arab, India, and China looks insignificant. Here he says the Arab is an eater up of other men's produce. Here he's talking about the Negro and self-reliance, too little intellect. That's his argument. And they need a large measure of external guidance. That's interesting. So notice that he's using this particular label. Is he talking about people from Africa? What exactly is his point? And then are people from Africa or Negroes, does that count as a race? I thought we have one race, the human race. So he seems to be somebody interested in dividing people based into categories. Here we go back to Blumenbach's work. So Blumenbach comes up with these particular terms, and he uses the argument of race as a color. Notice Caucasian. We normally think white here, but that is a reference to a place. So he's using region. Mongolian is a very interesting phrase there. Ethiopian, I guess that's Africa. So now we're also identifying a place. So if you find yourself confused with this, say, wait a minute, none of this makes sense. I think that's kind of the point, and I'm trying to point all of that out. Here we see another image of Blumenbach looking at the concept of race. So when we use the argument black, white, red, yellow, we're buying into his particular theory. History and the Mongolian. So now we're going to look at the offensive use of the term Mongolian, and we have to look at the work of Langdon Down. So Downey is doing research on people with Down syndrome, and he makes a pretty racist conclusion based on looks. And what he does is he looks at the Asian eye and he makes a reference, a connection to people with Down syndrome. And his work primarily is looking at people with Down syndrome, kind of carries over into racial theory. So here we see some of his writings where he's talking about the Mongolian or the yellow race. So I don't know if this means everybody in Asia, Indochina. Does a Filipino count in this? I don't know. So it definitely seems to be very complicated. And all I'm trying to do is just point out the hypocrisy in all of these theories. Which if we go back here, I want to also mention that, if we think about these terms here again, based on, where we are so far in this screencast, this is going to change. What if we gave students in, let's say, Saudi Arabia this same questionnaire? What about in Africa? Their responses are going to be completely different. Why? Because it's based on Saudi Arabia or Africa's social constructs, these made up understandings that have no meaning, but actually do have meaning. Race doesn't mean anything, yet race means everything. Even though race is supposed to be about biology, the social constructs argue against them when you actually start to study them. So here we see some more offensive language from Downey. And again, nothing to be, not that I'm trying to glorify this individual in any way, just give an understanding of where these terms come from, because this term definitely used by U.S. presidents. Here we see the red race, the black race. So he's using, obviously, Blumenbach's theory on race as a color. So if you're thinking all of these labels are wrong at this point and I have no idea what to call somebody, then I think, the screencast is helping. Determine which of the following is race, culture, nationality, or ethnicity. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to look, and I just want you to think about the image and think about what it counts as. So here, how would you say, is this race, culture, nationality, or ethnicity? Well, it can't be race, because I think the only thing we're going to argue here is clothing. I don't necessarily think that clothing counts as race. Is it culture? So if we go back to that definition of culture, we want to go with the one with with religion. So when we go back to that definition here, which one has religion? Does any of them have religion? Common ancestry, possibly nation, language, and religion. But it could also be culture. So this seems to be questionable. And again, I'm just using the images. Best answer, culture, due to the religious identifiable clothing. Here we're looking at another race, culture, nationality. What's the other one? Ethnicity. What does this count as? Then, of course, we see the answer. I'm using nationality because the woman is identifying with the citizenship. Like, all we have to go on are these flags. And the flags are identifying a nation, in this case, Puerto Rico. However, ethnicity could be Hispanic. I guess now it's dependent. But all we're going off of is the image. The only thing we have here is the flag as the thing to identify. What about this item here, this image? Read the reference to the headgear. That is what I want you to think about. And all I'm trying to do is just point out the absurdity in these labels. If there's one race, the human race, how is it that we could look at this image and start to come up with a biased racial opinion and a judgment about this individual? Possibly culture due to the identifiable religious clothing. However, Arab could be another ethnically used term. If he's a Saudi citizen, then maybe Saudi Arabian, then we're going to use nationality. If you're thinking this makes no sense and I'm confused, I think that precisely is the point. What about this? Here we have I believe it's a Klingon from Star Trek. Well, you do have a common language. So would that count as culture or ethnicity? What about this individual? Like all I did here is search Africa, African boy. This is what came up. Race, if we're going to use Blumenbach's color classification. What if you have this image, yet you're living in a particular part here? So now we're looking at a region. Ethnicity due to Arab ethnicity. So that's now we're adding that item. So it disregards culture because we are identifying a place similar to the woman with the Puerto Rican flags. If we're concerned about a place, now we have to go ethnicity. That seems to be the issue. So before it was religion, and so we went with culture on that particular one. And now we're looking at a region. What about this image here? So we see somebody white, human Blumenbach's theory, yet they have elements of hip hop culture. And there we see the answer there. Is video gaming a culture? What is South Brunswick culture? What is hip hop culture? Keep in mind, we'll be making some references to the vicious cycle, trying to give you some examples of this chart that we have addressed in the gay rights section. And I want to see if you can apply these to various groups. And in this case, deaf Americans, because this is something that we're going to be looking at next class. So we definitely want to be able to apply this vicious cycle diagram, because the vicious cycle is going to play a key role. So when we see prejudice and discrimination, I always think of these as small microaggressions, where these are big institutions. This is institutional racism or discrimination, and that creates a belief in inferiority that confirms these beliefs, and then the cycle kind of repeats. So if you have no understanding of this image here, this is the case that proves overturns Plessy-Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Ed. So in this case, they needed to prove that segregation created a inferiority complex among the African Americans that were targeted. Even that label, African Americans, is every Black American from Africa, how many were born here. So these terms definitely change over time. I'm not just trying to point that out. So in this case, the lawyer is arguing that segregation, the social disadvantage, created a sense of inferiority, right here, the belief in inferiority. And so he showed Black boys and girls, 7 years old, white dolls and black dolls, and he asked them questions. Which doll is good? Which one is bad? Which one do you want to be? Which one do you not want to be? And as a result of that, what they found was that every time you associated with the black doll, it was always something negative. And because these children were so young, he was arguing that that was the evidence that there was a belief in inferiority among the individual, the target of, in this case, the vicious cycle. So you could also do this for homosexuality, for Muslims in America, social disadvantages, prejudice and discrimination, maybe being called specific names, and dealing with issues at the airport that may create a belief in inferiority among Muslim Americans. That's pretty much where we're at. If you find yourself struggling with some of this because there seems to be a lot of gray area and overlap, you are on the right track. Keep in mind, we'll also start addressing some of these presentation topics that you are responsible for knowing the definitions of.